Chapter 6. Scene at a ship's concert. Ship's concerts are given in aid of the seamen's orphans and widows, and, after one has been present at a few of them, one seems to feel that any right-thinking orphan or widow would rather jog along and take a chance of starvation than to be the innocent cause of such things. They open with a long speech from the master of ceremonies, so long, as a rule, that it is only the thought of what is going to happen afterwards that enables the audience to bear it with fortitude. This done, the amateur talent is unleashed, and the grim work begins. It was not till after the all-too-brief intermission for rest and recuperation that the newly formed team of Marlowe and Hignett was scheduled to appear. Previous to this there had been dark deeds done in the quiet saloon. The lecturer on deep-sea fish had fulfilled his threat and spoken at great length on a subject which, treated by a master of oratory, would have palled on the audience after 10 or 15 minutes. And at the end of 15 minutes this speaker had only just got past the haddocks and was feeling his way tentatively through the shrimps. The rosary had been sung, and there was an uneasy doubt as to whether it was not going to be sung again after the interval, the latest rumour being that the second of the rival lady singers had proved adamant to all appeals, and intended to fight the thing out on the lines she had originally chosen, if they put her in irons. A young man had recited Gunga Din, and, wilfully misinterpreting the gratitude of the audience that it was over for a desire for more, had followed it with Fuzzy Wuzzy. His sister, these things run in families, had sung My Little Grey Home in the West rather sombrely, for she had wanted to sing the Rosary, and, with the same obtuseness which characterized her brother, had come back and rendered plantation songs. The audience was now examining its programs in the interval of silence in order to ascertain the duration of the sentence still remaining unexpired. It was shocked to read the following. 7. A little imitation. S. Marlowe. All over the saloon you could see fair women and brave men wilting in their seats. Imitation! The word, as Keats would have said, was like a knell. Many of these people were old travellers, and their minds went back wincingly, as one recalls forgotten wounds, to occasions when performers at ship's concerts had imitated whole strings of Dickens characters, or, with the assistance of a few hats and a little false hair, had endeavoured to portray Napoleon, Bismarck, Shakespeare, and other of the famous dead. In this printed line on the programme there was nothing to indicate the nature or scope of the imitation which this S. Marlowe proposed to inflict upon them. They could only sit and wait, and hope that it would be short. There was a sinking of hearts as Eustace Hignett moved down the room and took his place at the piano. A pianist? This argued more singing. The more pessimistic began to fear that the imitation was going to be one of those imitations of well-known opera artistes which, though rare, do occasionally add to the horrors of ship's concerts. They stared at Hignett apprehensively. There seemed to be something ominous in the man's very aspect. His face was very pale and set, the face of one approaching a task at which his humanity shudders. They could not know that the pallor of Eustace Hignett was due entirely to the slight tremor which, even on the calmest nights, the engines of an ocean liner produce in the flooring of a dining saloon, and to that faint, yet well-defined, smell of cooked meats which clings to a room where a great many people have recently been eating a great many meals. A few beads of cold perspiration were clinging to Eustace Hignett's brow. He looked straight before him with unseeing eyes. He was thinking hard of the Sahara. So tense was Eustace's concentration that he did not see Billie Bennet, seated in the front row. Billie had watched him enter with a little thrill of embarrassment. She wished that she had been content with one of the seats at the back, but Jane Hubbard had insisted on the front row. She always had a front row seat at witch dances in Africa, and the thing had become a habit. In order to avoid recognition for as long as possible, Billie now put up her fan and turned to Jane. She was surprised to see that her friend was staring eagerly before her with a fixity almost equal to that of Eustace. Under her breath she muttered an exclamation of surprise in one of the lesser-known dialects of northern Nigeria. "Billie!" she whispered sharply. "What is the matter, Jane?" "Who is that man at the piano? Do you know him?" "As a matter of fact, I do," said Billie. "His name is Hignett. Why?" "It's the man I met on the subway!" She breathed a sigh. "Poor little fellow, how miserable he looks!" At this moment their conversation was interrupted. Eustace Hignett, pulling himself together with a painful effort, raised his hands and struck a crashing chord, and as he did so, there appeared through the door at the far end of the saloon a figure at the sight of which the entire audience started convulsively, with the feeling that a worse thing had befallen them than even they had looked for. The figure was richly clad in some scarlet material. Its face was a grisly black, and below the nose appeared what seemed a horrible gash. It advanced towards them, smoking a cigar. "Hello, Ernest," it said. And then it seemed to pause expectantly, as though desiring some reply. Dead silence reigned in the saloon. "Hello, Ernest!" Those nearest the piano, and nobody more quickly than Jane Hubbard, now observed that the white face of the man on the stool had grown whiter still. His eyes gazed out glassily from under his damp brow. He looked like a man who was seeing some ghastly sight. The audience sympathized with him. They felt like that too. In all human plans there is ever some slight hitch, some little miscalculation which just makes all the difference. A moment's thought should have told Eustace Hignett that a half-smoked cigar was one of the essential properties to any imitation of the eminent Mr. Tinney, but he had completely overlooked the fact. The cigar came as an absolute surprise to him, and it could not have affected him more powerfully if it had been a voice from the tomb. He stared at it pallidly, like Macbeth at the ghost of Banquo. It was a strong, lively young cigar, and its curling smoke played lightly about his nostrils. His jaw fell. His eyes protruded. He looked for a long moment like one of those deep-sea fishes concerning which the recent lecturer had spoken so searchingly. Then, with the cry of a stricken animal, he bounded from his seat and fled for the deck. There was a rustle at Billie's side as Jane Hubbard rose and followed him. Jane was deeply stirred. Even as he sat, looking so pale and piteous at the piano, her big heart had gone out to him, and now, in his moment of anguish, he seemed to bring to the surface everything that was best and manliest in her nature. Thrusting aside with one sweep of her powerful arm a steward who happened to be between her and the door, she raced in pursuit. Sam Marlowe had watched his cousin's dash for the open with a consternation so complete that his senses seemed to have left him. A general, deserted by his men on some stricken field, might have felt something akin to his emotion. Of all the learned professions, the imitation of Mr. Frank Tinney is the one which can least easily be carried through single-handed. The man at the piano, the leader of the orchestra, is essential. He is the life-blood of the entertainment. Without him, nothing can be done. For an instant Sam stood there gaping blankly. Then the open door of the saloon seemed to beckon an invitation. He made for it, reached it, passed through it. That concluded his efforts in aid of the seamen's orphans and widows. The spell which had lain on the audience broke. This imitation seemed to them to possess in an extraordinary measure the one quality which renders amateur imitations tolerable, that of brevity. They had seen many amateur imitations, but never one as short as this. The saloon echoed with their applause. It brought no balm to Samuel Marlowe. He did not hear it. He had fled for refuge to his stateroom, and was lying in the lower berth, chewing the pillow, a soul in torment. Chapter 7. Sundered Hearts. There was a tap at the door. Sam sat up dizzily. He had lost all count of time. "Who's that?" "I have a note for you, sir." It was the level voice of J.B. Midgley, the steward. The stewards of the White Star Line, besides being the civilest and most obliging body of men in the world, all have soft and pleasant voices. A White Star steward, waking you up at 6:30 to tell you that your bath is ready, when you wanted to sleep on till 12, is the nearest human approach to the nightingale. A what? A note, sir. Sam jumped up and switched on the light. He went to the door and took the note from J.B. Midgley, who, his mission accomplished, retired in an orderly manner down the passage. Sam looked at the letter with a thrill. He had never seen the handwriting before, but, with the eye of love, he recognized it. It was just the sort of hand he would have expected Billie to write, round and smooth and flowing, the writing of a warm-hearted girl. He tore open the envelope. "Please come up to the top deck. I want to speak to you." Sam could not disguise it from himself that he was a little disappointed. I don't know if you see anything wrong with the letter, but the way Sam looked at it was that, for a first love letter, it might have been longer and perhaps a shade warmer. And, without running any risk of writer's cramp, she might have signed it. However, these were small matters. No doubt the dear girl had been in a hurry and so forth. The important point was that he was going to see her. "When a man's afraid," sings the bard, "a beautiful maid is a cheering sight to see," and the same truth holds good when a man has made an exhibition of himself at a ship's concert. A woman's gentle sympathy. That was what Samuel Marlowe wanted more than anything else at the moment. That, he felt, was what the doctor ordered. He scrubbed the burnt cork off his face with all possible speed, and changed his clothes, and made his way to the upper deck. It was like Billie, he felt, to have chosen this spot for their meeting. It would be deserted, and it was hallowed for them both by sacred associations. She was standing at the rail, looking out over the water. The moon was quite full. Out on the horizon to the south its light shone on the sea, making it look like the silver beach of some distant fairy island. The girl appeared to be wrapped in thought, and it was not till the sharp crack of Sam's head against an overhanging stanchion announced his approach that she turned. "Oh, is that you?" "Yes." "You've been a long time." "It wasn't an easy job," explained Sam, "getting all that burnt cork off. You've no notion how the stuff sticks. You have to use butter." She shuddered. "Don't." "But I did. You have to with burnt cork." "Don't tell me these horrible things." Her voice rose almost hysterically. "I never want to hear the words burnt cork mentioned again as long as I live." "I feel exactly the same." Sam moved to her side. "Darling," he said in a low voice, "it was like you to ask me to meet you here. I know what you were thinking. You thought that I should need sympathy. You wanted to pet me, to smooth my wounded feelings, to hold me in your arms and tell me that, as we loved each other, what did anything else matter?" "I didn't." "You didn't?" "No, I didn't." "Oh, you didn't? I thought you did." He looked at her wistfully. "I thought," he said, "that possibly you might have wished to comfort me. I have been through a great strain. I have had a shock." "And what about me?" she demanded passionately. "Haven't I had a shock?" He melted at once. "Have you had a shock too? Poor little thing. Sit down and tell me all about it." She looked away from him, her face working. "Can't you understand what a shock I have had? I thought you were the perfect knight." "Yes, isn't it?" "Isn't what?" "I thought you said it was a perfect night." "I said I thought you were the perfect knight." "Oh, ah." A sailor crossed the deck, a dim figure in the shadows, went over to a sort of raised summer-house with a brass thingamy in it, fooled about for a moment, and went away again. Sailors earn their money easily. "Yes?" said Sam when he had gone. "I forget what I was saying." "Something about my being the perfect knight." "Yes, I thought you were." "That's good." "But you're not." "No?" "No." "Oh." Silence fell. Sam was feeling hurt and bewildered. He could not understand her mood. He had come up expecting to be soothed and comforted, and she was like a petulant iceberg. Cynically, he recalled some lines of poetry which he had had to write out 100 times on one occasion at school as a punishment for having introduced a white mouse into chapel. O woman, in our hours of ease, unsomething, something, something, please, when tiddly-umpty brow, a something, something, something thou. He had forgotten the exact words, but the gist of it had been that woman, however she might treat a man in times of prosperity, could be relied on to rally round and do the right thing when he was in trouble. How little the poet had known woman. "Why not?" he said huffily. She gave a little sob. "I put you on a pedestal, and I find you have feet of clay. You have blurred the image which I formed of you. I can never think of you again without picturing you as you stood in that saloon, stammering and helpless." "Well, what can you do when your pianist runs out on you?" "You could have done something." The words she had spoken only yesterday to Jane Hubbard came back to her. "I can't forgive a man for looking ridiculous. Oh, what," she cried, "induced you to try to give an imitation of Bert Williams?" Sam started, stung to the quick. "It wasn't Bert Williams. It was Frank Tinney." "Well, how was I to know?" "I did my best," said Sam sullenly. "That is the awful thought." "I did it for your sake." "I know. It gives me a horrible sense of guilt." She shuddered again. Then suddenly, with the nervous quickness of a woman unstrung, thrust a small black gollywog into his hand. "Take it." "What's this?" "You bought it for me yesterday at the barber's shop. It is the only present which you have given me. Take it back." "I don't want it. I shouldn't know what to do with it." "You must take it," she said in a low voice. "It is a symbol." "A what?" "A symbol of our broken love." "I don't see how you make that out. It's a gollywog." "I can never marry you now." "What? Good heavens, don't be absurd." "I can't." "Oh, go on, have a dash at it," he said encouragingly, though his heart was sinking. She shook her head. "No, I couldn't." "Oh, hang it all." "I couldn't. I'm a very strange girl." "You're a very silly girl." "I don't see what right you have to say that," she flared. "I don't see what right you have to say you can't marry me and try to load me up with gollywogs," he retorted with equal heat. "Oh, can't you understand?" "No, I'm dashed if I can." She looked at him despondently. "When I said I would marry you, you were a hero to me. You stood to me for everything that was noble and brave and wonderful. I had only to shut my eyes to conjure up the picture of you as you dived off the rail that morning. Now," her voice trembled, "if I shut my eyes now, I can only see a man with a hideous black face making himself the laughing-stock of the ship. How could I marry you, haunted by that picture?" "But good heavens, you talk as though I made a habit of blacking up. You talk as though you expected me to come to the altar smothered in burnt cork." "I shall always think of you as I saw you tonight." She looked at him sadly. "There's a bit of black still on your left ear." He tried to take her hand, but she drew it away. He fell back as if struck. "So this is the end," he muttered. "Yes, it's partly on your ear and partly on your cheek." "So this is the end," he repeated. "You had better go below and ask your steward to give you some more butter." He laughed bitterly. "Well, I might have expected it. I might have known what would happen. Eustace warned me. Eustace was right. He knows women, as I do now. Women. What mighty ills have not been done by woman? Who was't betrayed the what's-its-name? A woman. Who and so on. A woman. So all is over. There is nothing to be said but good-bye?" "No." "Good-bye then, Miss Bennet." "Good-bye," said Billie sadly. I'm sorry." "Don't mention it." "You do understand, don't you?" You have made everything perfectly clear. I hope you won't be unhappy. Unhappy? Sam produced a strangled noise from his larynx like the cry of a shrimp in pain. Unhappy? Ha ha! I'm not unhappy. Whatever gave you that idea? I'm smiling. I'm laughing. I feel I've had a merciful escape. Oh, ha ha! It's very unkind and rude of you to say that. It reminds me of a moving picture I saw in New York. It was called Saved from the Scaffold. Oh. I'm not unhappy. What have I got to be unhappy about? What on earth does any man want to get married for? I don't. Give me my gay bachelor life. My Uncle Charlie used to say, it's better luck to get married than it is to be kicked in the head by a mule. But he was a man who always looked on the bright side. Good night, Miss Bennet, and goodbye forever. He turned on his heel and strode across the deck. From a white heaven the moon still shone benignantly down, mocking him. He had spoken bravely. The most captious critic could not but have admitted that he had made a good exit. But already his heart was aching. As he drew near to his stateroom, he was amazed and disgusted to hear a high tenor voice raised in song proceeding from behind the closed door. I fear na fine shining armour, though his lance be sharp and keen, but I fear the glamour through thy drooping lashes seen. I fear the glamour. Sam flung open the door wrathfully. That Eustace Hignett should still be alive was bad. He had pictured him hurling himself overboard and bobbing about, a pleasing sight in the wake of the vessel. That he should be singing was an outrage. Remorse, Sam felt, should have stricken Eustace Hignett dumb. Instead of which, here he was comporting himself like a blasted linnet. It was all wrong. The man could have no conscience whatever. Well, he said sternly, so there you are. Eustace Hignett looked up brightly, even beamingly. In the brief interval which had elapsed since Sam had seen him last, an extraordinary transformation had taken place in this young man. His wan look had disappeared. His eyes were bright. His face wore that beastly, self-satisfied smirk which you see in pictures advertising certain makes of fine mesh underwear. If Eustace Hignett had been a full-page drawing in a magazine with, "My dear fellow, I always wear Sigsbee's superfine featherweight," printed underneath him, he could not have looked more pleased with himself. "Hullo," he said. "I was wondering where you had got to." "Never mind," said Sam coldly, "where I had got to. Where did you get to, and why, you poor miserable worm?" he went on in a burst of generous indignation. "What have you to say for yourself? What do you mean by dashing away like that and killing my little entertainment?" "Awfully sorry, old man. I hadn't foreseen the cigar. I was bearing up tolerably well till I began to sniff the smoke. Then everything seemed to go black. I don't mean you, of course. You were black already. And I got the feeling that I simply must get on deck and drown myself." "Well, why didn't you?" demanded Sam with a strong sense of injury. "I might have forgiven you then." "But to come down here and find you singing—" A soft light came into Eustace Hignett's eyes. "I want to tell you all about that," he said. "It's the most astonishing story. A miracle, you might almost call it. Makes you believe in fate and all that kind of thing. A week ago I was on the subway in New York." He broke off while Sam cursed him, the subway, and the city of New York in the order named. "My dear chap, what is the matter?" "What is the matter? Ha!" "Something is the matter," persisted Eustace Hignett. "I can tell it by your manner. Something has happened to disturb and upset you. I know you so well that I can pierce the mask. What is it? Tell me." "Ha! Ha!" "You surely can't still be brooding on that concert business. Why, that's all over. I take it that after my departure you made the most colossal ass of yourself, but why let that worry you? These things cannot affect one permanently." "Can't they? Let me tell you that, as a result of that concert, my engagement is broken off." Eustace sprang forward with outstretched hand. "Not really? How splendid! Accept my congratulations. This is the finest thing that could possibly have happened. These are not idle words. As one who has been engaged to the girl himself, I speak feelingly. You are well out of it, Sam." Sam thrust aside his hand. Had it been his neck, he might have clutched it eagerly, but he drew the line at shaking hands with Eustace Hignett. "My heart is broken," he said with dignity. "That feeling will pass, giving way to one of devout thankfulness. I know, I've been there. After all, Wilhelmina Bennett, what is she? A rag and a bone and a hank of hair." "She is nothing of the kind," said Sam, revolted. "Pardon me," said Eustace firmly. "I speak as an expert. I know her, and I repeat, she is a rag and a bone and a hank of hair." "She is the only girl in the world, and owing to your idiotic behaviour, I have lost her." "You speak of the only girl in the world," said Eustace blithely. "If you want to hear about the only girl in the world, I will tell you. A week ago I was on the subway in New York." "I'm going to bed," said Sam brusquely. "All right, I'll tell you while you're undressing." "I don't want to listen." "A week ago," said Eustace Hignett, "I will ask you to picture me seated after some difficulty in a carriage in the New York subway. I got into a conversation with a girl with an elephant gun." Sam revised his private combination service in order to include the elephant gun. "She was my soul-mate," proceeded Eustace with quiet determination. "I didn't know it at the time, but she was. She had grave brown eyes, a wonderful personality, and this elephant gun." "Did she shoot you with it?" "Shoot me? What do you mean? Why, no." "The girl must have been a fool," said Sam bitterly. "The chance of a lifetime, and she missed it. Where are my pajamas?" "I haven't seen your pajamas. She talked to me about this elephant gun and explained its mechanism. She told me the correct part of a hippopotamus to aim at, how to make a nourishing soup out of mangoes, and what to do when bitten by a Borneo wire snake. You can imagine how she soothed my aching heart. My heart, if you recollect, was aching at the moment, quite unnecessarily if I had only known, because it was only a couple of days since my engagement to Wilhelmina Bennett had been broken off. Well, we parted at 66th Street, and, strange as it may seem, I forgot all about her." "Do it again." "Tell it again?" "Good heavens, no. Forget all about her again." "Nothing," said Eustace Hignett gravely, "could make me do that. Our souls have blended. Our beings have called to one another from their deepest depths, saying— There are your pajamas over in the corner. Saying, 'You are mine. How could I forget her after that?' Well, as I was saying, we parted. Little did I know that she was sailing on this very boat. But just now she came to me as I writhed on the deck." "Did you writhe?" asked Sam, with a flicker of moody interest. "I certainly did." "That's good." "But not for long." "That's bad." "She came to me and healed me. Sam, that girl is an angel." "Switch off the light when you've finished." She seemed to understand without a word how I was feeling. There are some situations which do not need words. She went away and returned with a mixture of some description in a glass. I don't know what it was. It had Worcester sauce in it. She put it to my lips. She made me drink it. She said it was what she always used in Africa for bull calves with the staggers. Well, believe me or believe me not. Are you asleep? Yes. Believe me or believe me not, in under 2 minutes I was not merely freed from the nausea caused by your cigar. I was smoking myself. I was walking the deck with her without the slightest qualm. I was even able to look over the side from time to time and comment on the beauty of the moon on the water. I have said some mordant things about women since I came on board this boat. I withdraw them unreservedly. They still apply to girls like Wilhelmina Bennett, but I have ceased to include the whole sex in my remarks. Jane Hubbard has restored my faith in woman. Sam! Sam!" "What?" "I said that Jane Hubbard had restored my faith in woman." "Oh, all right." Eustace Hignett finished undressing and got into bed. With a soft smile on his face, he switched off the light. There was a long silence, broken only by the distant purring of the engines. At about 12:30 a voice came from the lower berth. "Sam!" "What is it now?" "There is a sweet womanly strength about her, Sam. She was telling me once she killed a panther with a hat-pin." Sam groaned and tossed on his mattress. Silence fell again. "At least, I think it was a panther," said Eustace Hignett at 1:15. "Either a panther or a puma." Chapter 8. Sir Mallaby offers a suggestion. 1. A week after the liner Atlantic had docked at Southampton, Sam Marlowe might have been observed, and was observed by various of the residents, sitting on a bench on the esplanade of that rising watering-place, Bingley-on-the-Sea, in Sussex. All watering-places on the south coast of England are blots on the landscape, but though I am aware that by saying it I shall offend the civic pride of some of the others, none are so peculiarly foul as Bingley-on-the-Sea. The asphalt on the Bingley esplanade is several degrees more depressing than the asphalt on other esplanades. The Swiss waiters at the Hotel Magnificent, where Sam was stopping, are in a class of bungling incompetence by themselves, the envy and despair of all the other Swiss waiters at all the other Hotels Magnificent along the coast. For dreariness of aspect, Bingley-on-the-Sea stands alone. The very waves that break on its shingle seem to creep up the beach reluctantly, as if it revolted them to have to come to such a place. Why, then, was Sam Marlowe visiting this ozone-swept Gehenna? Why, with all the rest of England at his disposal, had he chosen to spend a week at breezy, blighted Bingley? Simply because he had been disappointed in love. Nothing is more curious than the myriad ways in which reaction from an unfortunate love affair manifests itself in various men. No two males behave in the same way under the spur of female fickleness. Archilocum, for instance, according to the Roman writer, proprio rabis armavit iambo. It is no good pretending out of politeness that you know what that means, so I will translate. Rabis, his grouch, armavit, armed, archilocum, archilochus, iambo, with the iambic, proprio, his own invention. In other words, when the poet Archilochus was handed his hat by the lady of his affections, he consoled himself by going off and writing satirical verse about her in a new metre which he had thought up immediately after leaving the house. That was the way the thing affected him. On the other hand, we read in a recent issue of a London daily paper that John Simmons, 31, a meat salesman, was accused of assaulting an officer while in the discharge of his duty, at the same time using profane language whereby the officer went in fear of his life. Constable Riggs deposed that on the evening of the 11th instant, while he was on his beat, prisoner accosted him, and, after offering to fight him for 4d, drew off his right boot and threw it at his head. Accused, questioned by the magistrate, admitted the charge and expressed regret, pleading that he had had words with his young woman, and it had upset him. Neither of these courses appealed to Samuel Marlowe. He had sought relief by slinking off alone to the Hotel Magnificent at Bingley-on-the-Sea. It was the same spirit which has often moved other men in similar circumstances to go off to the Rockies to shoot grizzlies. To a certain extent, the Hotel Magnificent had dulled the pain. At any rate, the service and cooking there had done much to take his mind off it. His heart still ached, but he felt equal to going to London and seeing his father, which of course he ought to have done 7 days before. He rose from his bench. He had sat down on it directly after breakfast, and went back to the hotel to inquire about trains. An hour later he had begun his journey, and 2 hours after that he was at the door of his father's office. The offices of the old established firm of Marlowe, Thorpe, Prescott, Winslow, and Appleby are in Ridgway's Inn, not far from Fleet Street. The brass plate, let into the woodwork of the door, is misleading. Reading it, you get the impression that on the other side, quite a covey of lawyers await your arrival. The name of the firm leads you to suppose that there will be barely standing room in the office. You picture Thorpe jostling you aside as he makes for Prescott to discuss with him the latest case of demurrer, and Winslow and Appleby treading on your toes, deep in conversation on replevin. But these legal firms dwindle. The years go by and take their toll, snatching away here a Prescott, there an Appleby, till before you know where you are down to your last lawyer. The only surviving member of the firm of Marlowe, Thorpe, what I said before, was, at the time with which this story deals, Sir Mallaby Marlowe, son of the original founder of the firm, and father of the celebrated black-face comedian, Samuel of that ilk, and the outer office, where callers were received and parked till Sir Mallaby could find time for them, was occupied by a single clerk. When Sam opened the door, this clerk, John Peters by name, was seated on a high stool, holding in one hand a half-eaten sausage, in the other an extraordinarily large and powerful-looking revolver. At the sight of Sam, he laid down both engines of destruction and beamed. He was not a particularly successful beamer, being hampered by a cast in one eye, which gave him a truculent and sinister look, but those who knew him knew that he had a heart of gold, and were not intimidated by his repellent face. Between Sam and himself there had always existed terms of great cordiality, starting from the time when the former was a small boy, and it had been John Peters' mission to take him now to the zoo, now to the train back to school. "Why, Mr. Samuel!" "Hullo, Peters." "We were expecting you back a week ago." "Oh, I had something to see to before I came to town," said Sam carelessly. "So you got back safe," said John Peters. "Safe? Why, of course." Peters shook his head. "I confess that, when there was this delay in your coming here, I sometimes feared something might have happened to you. I recall mentioning it to the young lady who recently did me the honour to promise to become my wife." "Ocean liners aren't often wrecked nowadays." "I was thinking more of the brawls on shore. America's a dangerous country. But perhaps you were not in touch with the underworld." "I don't think I was." "Ah," said John Peters significantly. He took up the revolver, gave it a fond and almost paternal look, and replaced it on the desk. "What on earth are you doing with that thing?" asked Sam. Mr. Peters lowered his voice. "I'm going to America myself in a few days' time, Mr. Samuel. It's my annual holiday, and the governor's sending me over with papers in connection with The People versus Schultz and Bowen. It's a big case over there. A client of ours is mixed up in it, an American gentleman. I am to take these important papers to his legal representative in New York, so I thought it best to be prepared." The first smile that he had permitted himself for nearly 2 weeks flitted across Sam's face. "What on earth sort of place do you think New York is?" he asked. "It's safer than London." "Ah, but what about the underworld? I've seen these American films that they send over here, Mr. Samuel. Did you ever see Wolves of the Bowery? There was a man in that in just my position, carrying important papers, and what they didn't try to do to him. No, I'm taking no chances, Mr. Samuel." "I should have said you were, lugging that thing about with you." Mr. Peters seemed wounded. "Oh, I understand the mechanism perfectly, and I am becoming a very fair shot. I take my little bite of food in here early and go and practice at the Rupert Street rifle range during my lunch hour. You'd be surprised how quickly one picks it up. When I get home of a night, I try how quickly I can draw. You have to draw like a flash of lightning, Mr. Samuel. If you'd ever seen a film called Two-Gun Thomas, you'd realize that. You haven't time to wait loitering about." Mr. Peters picked up a speaking tube and blew down it. "Mr. Samuel to see you, Sir Mallaby. Yes, sir, very good. Will you go right in, Mr. Samuel?" Sam proceeded to the inner office and found his father dictating into the attentive ear of Miss Milliken, his elderly and respectable stenographer, replies to his morning mail. Sir Mallaby Marlowe was a dapper little man, with a round, cheerful face and a bright eye. His morning coat had been cut by London's best tailor, and his trousers perfectly creased by a sedulous valet. A pink carnation in his buttonhole matched his healthy complexion. His golf handicap was 12. His sister, Mrs. Horace Hignett, considered him worldly. Dear Sirs, we are in receipt of your favour, and in reply beg to state that nothing will induce us... Where did I put that letter? Nothing will induce us... Oh, tell him to go to blazes, Miss Milliken. Very well, Sir Mallaby. That's that. Ready? Messrs. Brigney, Goole, and Butterworth. What infernal names these people have. Sirs, on behalf of our client... Oh, hello, Sam. Good morning, Father. Take a seat. I'm busy, but I'll be finished in a moment. Where was I, Miss Milliken? On behalf of our client... Oh, yes, on behalf of our client, Mr. Wibblesley Eggshaw... Where these people get their names, I'm hanged if I know. Your poor mother wanted to call you Hyacinth, Sam. You may not know it, but in the 90s when you were born, children were frequently christened Hyacinth. Well, I saved you from that. His attention now diverted to his son, Sir Mallaby seemed to remember that the latter had just returned from a long journey, and that he had not seen him for many weeks. He inspected him with interest. Very glad you're back, Sam. So, you didn't win? No, I got beaten in the semi-finals. American amateurs are a very hot lot, the best ones. I suppose you were weak on the greens. I warned you about that. You'll have to rub up your putting before next year. At the idea that any such mundane pursuit as practising putting could appeal to his broken spirit now, Sam uttered a bitter laugh. It was as if Dante had recommended some lost soul in the Inferno to occupy his mind by knitting jumpers. Well, you seem to be in great spirits, said Sir Mallaby approvingly. It's pleasant to hear your merry laugh again, isn't it, Miss Milliken? Extremely exhilarating, agreed the stenographer, adjusting her spectacles and smiling at Sam, for whom there was a soft spot in her heart. A sense of the futility of life oppressed Sam. As he gazed in the glass that morning, he had thought, not without a certain gloomy satisfaction, how remarkably pale and drawn his face looked. And these people seemed to imagine that he was in the highest spirits. His laughter, which had sounded to him like the wailing of a demon, struck Miss Milliken as exhilarating. On behalf of our client, Mr. Wibblesley Eggshaw, said Sir Mallaby, swooping back to duty once more, we beg to state that we are prepared to accept service... What time did you dock this morning? I landed nearly a week ago. A week ago? Then what the deuce have you been doing with yourself? Why haven't I seen you? I've been down at Bingley-on-the-Sea. Bingley? What on earth were you doing at that godforsaken place? Wrestling with myself, said Sam, with simple dignity. Sir Mallaby's agile mind had leaped back to the letter which he was answering. We should be glad to meet you. Wrestling, eh? Well, I like a boy to be fond of manly sports. Still, life isn't all athletics. Don't forget that. Life is real. Life is... How does it go, Miss Milliken? Miss Milliken folded her hands and shut her eyes, her invariable habit when called upon to recite. Life is real, life is earnest, and the grave is not its goal. Dust thou art, to dust returnest, was not spoken of the soul. Art is long, and time is fleeting, and our hearts, though stout and brave, still like muffled drums are beating funeral marches to the grave. Lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and, departing, leave behind us footsteps on the sands of time. Let us then, said Miss Milliken respectfully, be up and doing. All right, said Sir Mallaby. I don't want it all. Life is real, life is earnest, Sam. I want to speak to you about that when I've finished answering these letters. Where was I? We should be glad to meet you at any time if you will make an appointment. Bingley-on-the-Sea? Good heavens! Why Bingley-on-the-Sea? Why not Margate while you were about it? Margate is too bracing. I did not wish to be braced. Bingley suited my mood. It was grey and dark, and it rained all the time, and the sea slunk about in the distance like some baffled beast. He stopped, becoming aware that his father was not listening. Sir Mallaby's attention had returned to the letter. "Oh, what's the good of answering this dashed thing at all?" said Sir Mallaby. "Brigney, Goole, and Butterworth know perfectly well that they've got us in a cleft stick. Butterworth knows it better than Goole, and Brigney knows it better than Butterworth. This young fool Eggshaw, Sam, admits that he wrote the girl 23 letters, 12 of them in verse and 21 specifically asking her to marry him, and he comes to me and expects me to get him out of it. The girl is suing him for 10,000. How like a woman!" Miss Milliken bridled reproachfully at this slur on her sex. Sir Mallaby took no notice of it whatever. "If you will make an appointment when we can discuss the matter without prejudice. Get those typed, Miss Milliken. Have a cigar, Sam. Miss Milliken, tell Peters as you go out that I am occupied with a conference, and can see nobody for half an hour." When Miss Milliken had withdrawn, Sir Mallaby occupied 10 seconds of the period which he had set aside for communion with his son in staring silently at him. "I'm glad you're back, Sam," he said at length. "I want to have a talk with you. You know, it's time you were settling down. I've been thinking about you while you were in America, and I've come to the conclusion that I've been letting you drift along. Very bad for a young man. You're getting on. I don't say you're senile, but you're not 21 any longer, and at your age I was working like a beaver. You've got to remember that life is... Dash it, I've forgotten it again." He broke off and puffed vigorously into the speaking tube. "Miss Milliken, kindly repeat what you were saying just now about life. Yes, that's enough." He put down the instrument. "Yes, life is real, life is earnest," he said, gazing at Sam seriously. "And the grave is not our goal. Lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime. In fact, it's time you took your coat off and started work." "I'm quite ready, father." "You didn't hear what I said," exclaimed Sir Mallaby with a look of surprise. "I said it was time you began work." "And I said I was quite ready." "Bless my soul, you've changed your views a trifle since I saw you last." "I have changed them altogether." Long hours of brooding among the red plush settees in the lounge of the Hotel Magnificent at Bingley-on-the-Sea had brought about this strange, even morbid attitude of mind in Samuel Marlowe. Work, he had decided, was the only medicine for his sick soul. Here, he felt, in this quiet office, far from the tumult and noise of the world, in a haven of torts and misdemeanours and Vic. 1, Cap. 3s, and all the rest of it, he might find peace. At any rate, it was worth taking a stab at it. "Your trip has done you good," said Sir Mallaby approvingly. "The sea air has given you some sense. I'm glad of it. It makes it easier for me to say something else that I've had on my mind for a good while. Sam, it's time you got married." Sam barked bitterly. His father looked at him with concern. "Swallow some smoke the wrong way?" "I was laughing," explained Sam with dignity. Sir Mallaby shook his head. "I don't want to discourage your high spirits, but I must ask you to approach this matter seriously. Marriage would do you a world of good, Sam. It would brace you up. You really ought to consider the idea. I was 2 years younger than you are when I married your poor mother, and it was the making of me. A wife might make something of you." "Impossible." "I don't see why she shouldn't. There's lots of good in you, my boy, though you may not think so." "When I said it was impossible," said Sam coldly, "I was referring to the impossibility of the possibility... I mean, that it was impossible that I could possibly... In other words, father, I can never marry. My heart is dead." "Your what?" "My heart." "Don't be a fool. There's nothing wrong with your heart. All our family have had hearts like steam engines. Probably you have been feeling a sort of burning. Knock off cigars, and that will soon stop." "You don't understand me. I mean that a woman has treated me in a way that has finished her whole sex as far as I am concerned. For me, women do not exist." "You didn't tell me about this," said Sir Mallaby, interested. "When did this happen? Did she jilt you?" "Yes." "In America, was it?" "On the boat." Sir Mallaby chuckled heartily. My dear boy, you don't mean to tell me that you're taking a shipboard flirtation seriously. Why, you're expected to fall in love with a different girl every time you go on a voyage. You'll get over this in a week. You'd have got over it by now if you hadn't gone and buried yourself in a depressing place like Bingley-on-the-Sea." The whistle of the speaking-tube blew. Sir Mallaby put the instrument to his ear. "All right." He turned to Sam. "I shall have to send you away now, Sam. Man waiting to see me. Good-bye. By the way, are you doing anything tonight?" "No." "Not got a wrestling match on with yourself or anything like that? Well, come to dinner at the house. 7:30. Don't be late." Sam went out. As he passed through the outer office, Miss Milliken intercepted him. "Oh, Mr. Sam!" "Yes?" "Excuse me, but will you be seeing Sir Mallaby again today?" "I'm dining with him tonight." "Then would you—I don't like to disturb him now when he is busy—would you mind telling him that I inadvertently omitted a stanza? It runs," said Miss Milliken, closing her eyes, "'Trust no future, howe'er pleasant. Let the dead past bury its dead. Act in the living present, heart within and God o'erhead.' Thank you so much. Good afternoon." 2. Sam, reaching Brutton Street at 7:15, was informed by the butler who admitted him that his father was dressing and would be down in a few minutes. The butler, an old retainer of the Marlowe family, who, if he had not actually dandled Sam on his knees when an infant, had known him as a small boy, was delighted to see him again. "Missed you very much, Sir Samuel. We all have," he said affectionately, as he preceded him to the drawing-room. "Yes?" said Sam absently. "Very much indeed, sir. I happened to remark only the other day that the place didn't seem the same without your happy laugh. It's good to see you back once more, looking so well and merry." Sam stalked into the drawing-room with the feeling that comes to all of us from time to time, that it is hopeless to struggle. The whole damned circle of his acquaintance seemed to have made up their minds that he had not a care in the world, so what was the use? He lowered himself into a deep arm-chair and lit a cigarette. Presently the butler reappeared with a cocktail on a tray. Sam drained it, and scarcely had the door closed behind the old retainer when an abrupt change came over the whole outlook. It was as if he had been a pianola and somebody had inserted a new record. Looking well and happy. He blew a smoke ring. Well, if it came to that, why not? Why shouldn't he look well and happy? What had he got to worry about? He was a young man, fit and strong, in the springtide of life, just about to plunge into an absorbing business. Why should he brood over a sentimental episode which had ended a little unfortunately? He would never see the girl again. If anything in this world was certain, that was. She would go her way, and he his. Samuel Marlowe rose from his chair a new man, to greet his father, who came in at that moment fingering a snowy white tie. Sam started at his parent's splendour in some consternation. "Great Scott, father! Are you expecting a lot of people? I thought we were dining alone." "That's all right, my boy. A dinner jacket is perfectly in order. We shall be quite a small party. 6 in all. You and I, a friend of mine and his daughter, a friend of my friend's friend, and my friend's friend's son." "Surely that's more than 6." "No." "It sounded more." "6," said Sir Mallaby firmly. He raised a shapely hand with the fingers outspread. "Count 'em for yourself." He twiddled his thumb. "Number 1, Bennett." "Who?" cried Sam. "Bennett. Rufus Bennett. He's an American over here for the summer. Haven't I ever mentioned his name to you? He's a great fellow, always thinking he's at death's door, but keeps up a fine appetite. I've been his legal representative in London for years. Then," Sir Mallaby twiddled his first finger, "there's his daughter, Wilhelmina, who has just arrived in England." A look of enthusiasm came into Sir Mallaby's face. "Sam, my boy, I don't intend to say a word about Miss Wilhelmina Bennett, because I think there's nothing more prejudicial than singing a person's praises in advance. I merely remark that I fancy you will appreciate her. I've only met her once, and then only for a few minutes, but what I say is, if there's a girl living who's likely to make you forget whatever fool of a woman you may be fancying yourself in love with at the moment, that girl is Wilhelmina Bennett. The others are Bennett's friend, Henry Mortimer, also an American, a big lawyer, I believe, on the other side, and his son Bream. I haven't met either of them. They ought to be here any moment now." He looked at his watch. "Ah, I think that was the front door. Yes, I can hear them on the stairs." Chapter 9. Rough Work at a Dinner Table. After the first shock of astonishment, Sam Marlowe had listened to his father's harangue with a growing indignation which, towards the end of the speech, had assumed proportions of a cold fury. If there is one thing the which your high-spirited young man resents, it is being the toy of Fate. He chafes at the idea that Fate had got it all mapped out for him. Fate, thought Sam, had constructed a cheap, mushy, sentimental, five-reel film scenario, and without consulting him had had the cool cheek to cast him for one of the puppets. He seemed to see Fate as a thin female with a soppy expression and pince-nez, sniffing a little as she worked the thing out. He could picture her glutinous satisfaction as she reread her scenario and gloated over its sure-fire qualities. There was not a flaw in the construction. It started off splendidly with a romantic meeting, had him guessing halfway through when the hero and heroine quarrelled and parted, apparently forever, and now the stage was all set for the reconciliation and the slow fade-out on the embrace. To bring this last scene about, Fate had had to permit herself a slight coincidence, but she did not jib at that. What we call coincidences are merely the occasions when Fate gets stuck in a plot and has to invent the next situation in a hurry. Sam Marlowe felt sulky and defiant. This girl had treated him shamefully, and he wanted to have nothing more to do with her. If he had had his wish, he would never have met her again. Fate, in her interfering way, had forced this meeting on him, and was now complacently looking to him to behave in a suitable manner. Well, he would show her. In a few seconds now, Billie and he would be meeting. He would be distant and polite. He would be cold and aloof. He would chill her to the bone and rip a hole in the scenario 6 feet wide. The door opened, and the room became full of Bennets and Mortimers. 2. Billie, looking, as Marlowe could not but admit, particularly pretty, headed the procession. Following her came a large, red-faced man whose buttons seemed to creak beneath the strain of their duties. After him trotted a small, thin, pale, semi-bald individual who wore glasses and carried his nose raised and puckered as though some faintly unpleasant smell were troubling his nostrils. The fourth member of the party was dear old Bream. There was a confused noise of mutual greetings and introductions, and then Bream got a good sight of Sam and napped forward with his right wing outstretched. "Why, hello," said Bream. "How are you, Mortimer?" said Sam coldly. "What, do you know my son?" exclaimed Sir Mallaby. "Came over in the boat together," said Bream. "Capital," said Sir Mallaby. "Old friends, eh? Miss Bennet," he turned to Billie, who had been staring wide-eyed at her late fiancé. "Let me present my son, Sam. Sam, this is Miss Bennet." "How do you do?" said Sam. "How do you do?" said Billie. "Bennet, you've never met my son, I think?" Mr. Bennet peered at Sam with protruding eyes which gave him the appearance of a rather unusually stout prawn. "How are you?" he asked, with such intensity that Sam unconsciously found himself replying to a question which does not as a rule call for any answer. "Very well, thanks." Mr. Bennet shook his head moodily. "You are lucky to be able to say so. Very few of us can assert as much. I can truthfully say that in the last 15 years I have not known what it is to enjoy sound health for a single day. Marlowe," he proceeded, swinging ponderously round on Sir Mallaby like a liner turning in the river, I assure you that at 4:25 this afternoon I was very nearly convinced that I should have to call you up on the phone and cancel this dinner engagement. When I took my temperature at 6:20... At this point the butler appeared at the door, announcing that dinner was served. Sir Mallaby Marlowe's dinner table, which, like most of the furniture in the house, had belonged to his deceased father, and had been built at a period when people liked things big and solid, was a good deal too spacious to be really ideal for a small party. A white sea of linen separated each diner from the diner opposite, and created a forced intimacy with the person seated next to him. Billie Bennet and Sam Marlowe, as a consequence, found themselves, if not exactly in a solitude of their own, at least sufficiently cut off from their kind to make silence between them impossible. Westward, Mr. Mortimer had engaged Sir Mallaby in a discussion on the recent case of Ouseley versus Ouseley, Figg, Mountjoy, Moseby Smith, and others, which, though too complicated to explain here, presented points of considerable interest to the legal mind. To the east, Mr. Bennet was relating to Bream the more striking of his recent symptoms. Billie felt constrained to make at least an attempt at conversation. "How strange meeting you here," she said. Sam, who had been crumbling bread in an easy and debonair manner, looked up and met her eye. Its expression was one of cheerful friendliness. He could not see his own eye, but he imagined and hoped that it was cold and forbidding, like the surface of some bottomless mountain tarn. "I beg your pardon." "I said, how strange meeting you here. I never dreamed Sir Mallaby was your father." "I knew it all along," said Sam, and there was an interval caused by the maid insinuating herself between them and collecting his soup plate. He sipped sherry and felt a sombre self-satisfaction. He had, he considered, given the conversation the right tone from the start. Cool and distant. Out of the corner of his eye he saw Billie bite her lip. He turned to her again. Now that he had definitely established the fact that he and she were strangers, meeting by chance at a dinner party, he was in a position to go on talking. "And how do you like England, Miss Bennet?" Billie's eye had lost its cheerful friendliness. A somewhat feline expression had taken its place. "Pretty well," she replied. "You don't like it?" "Well, the way I look at it is this. It's no use grumbling. One has got to realize that in England one is in a savage country, and one should simply be thankful one isn't eaten by the natives." "What makes you call England a savage country?" demanded Sam, a staunch patriot, deeply stung. "What would you call a country where you can't get ice, central heating, corn on the cob, or bathrooms? My father and Mr. Mortimer have just taken a house down on the coast, and there's just one niggly little bathroom in the place." "Is that your only reason for condemning England?" "Oh, no, it has other drawbacks." "Such as?" "Well, Englishmen, for instance. Young Englishmen in particular. English young men are awful, idle, rude, conceited, and ridiculous." Marlowe refused hock with a bitter intensity which nearly startled the old retainer, who had just offered it to him, into dropping the decanter. "How many English young men have you met?" Billie met his eye squarely and steadily. "Well, now that I come to think of it, not many. In fact, very few. As a matter of fact, only—" "Only?" "Well, very few," said Billie. "Yes," she said meditatively. "I suppose I really have been rather unjust. I should not have condemned a class simply because... I suppose there are young Englishmen who are not rude and ridiculous?" "I suppose there are American girls who have hearts." "Oh, plenty." "I'll believe that when I meet one." Sam paused. Cold aloofness was all very well, but this conversation was developing into a vulgar brawl. The ghosts of dead and gone Marlowes, all noted for their courtesy to the sex, seemed to stand beside his chair, eyeing him reprovingly. His work, they seemed to whisper, was becoming raw. It was time to jerk the interchange of thought back into the realm of distant civility. "Are you making a long stay in London, Miss Bennet?" "No, not long. We are going down to the country almost immediately. I told you my father and Mr. Mortimer had taken a house there." "You will enjoy that." "I'm sure I shall. Mr. Mortimer's son Bream will be there. That will be nice." "Why?" said Sam, backsliding. There was a pause. "He isn't rude and ridiculous, eh?" said Sam gruffly. "Oh no, his manners are perfect, and he has such a natural dignity," she went on, looking affectionately across the table at the heir of the Mortimers, who, finding Mr. Bennet's medical confidences a trifle fatiguing, was yawning broadly and absently balancing his wine-glass on a fork. "Besides," said Billie in a soft and dreamy voice, "we are engaged to be married." 3. Sam didn't care, of course. We, who have had the privilege of a glimpse into his iron soul, know that. He was not in the least upset by the news, just surprised. He happened to be raising his glass at the moment, and he registered a certain amount of restrained emotion by snapping the stem in half and shooting the contents over the tablecloth, but that was all. "Good heavens, Sam!" ejaculated Sir Mallaby, aghast. His wine-glasses were an old and valued set. Sam blushed as red as the stain on the cloth. "Awfully sorry, father. Don't know how it happened." "Something must have given you a shock," suggested Billie kindly. The old retainer rallied round with napkins, and Sir Mallaby, who was just about to dismiss the affair with the polished ease of a good host, suddenly became aware of the activities of Bream. That young man, on whose dreamy calm the accident had made no impression whatever, had successfully established the equilibrium of the glass and the fork, and was now cautiously inserting beneath the latter a section of a roll, the whole forming a charming picture in still life. "If that glass is in your way," said Sir Mallaby, as soon as he had hitched up his drooping jaw sufficiently to enable him to speak. He was beginning to feel that he would be lucky if he came out of this dinner party with a mere remnant of his precious set. "Oh, Sir Mallaby," said Billie, casting an adoring glance at the juggler, "you needn't be afraid that Bream will drop it. He isn't clumsy. He is wonderful at that sort of thing, simply wonderful. I think it's so splendid," said Billie, "when men can do things like that. I'm always trying to get Bream to do some of his tricks for people, but he's so modest he won't." "Refreshingly different," Sir Mallaby considered, "from the average drawing-room entertainer." "Yes," said Billie emphatically. "I think the most terrible thing in the world is a man who tries to entertain when he can't. Did I tell you about the man on board ship, father, at the ship's concert? Oh, it was the most awful thing you ever saw. Everybody was talking about it." She beamed round the table, and there was a note of fresh girlish gaiety in her voice. "This man got up to do an imitation of somebody, nobody knows to this day who it was meant to be, and he came into the saloon, and directly he saw the audience he got stage fright. He just stood there gurgling and not saying a word, and then suddenly his nerve failed him altogether, and he turned and tore out of the room like a rabbit. He absolutely ran, and he hadn't said a word. It was the most ridiculous exhibition I've ever seen." The anecdote went well. Of course, there will always be a small minority in any audience which does not appreciate a funny story, and there was one in the present case. But the bulk of the company roared with laughter. "Do you mean," cried Sir Mallaby, choking, "the poor idiot just stood there dumb?" "Well, he made a sort of yammering noise," said Billie, "but that only made him look sillier." "Deuced good," chuckled Sir Mallaby. "Funniest thing I ever heard in my life," gurgled Mr. Bennet, swallowing a digestive capsule. "May have been half-witted," suggested Mr. Mortimer. Sam leaned across the table with a stern, set face. He meant to change the conversation if he had to do it with a crowbar. "I hear you have taken a house in the country, Mr. Mortimer," he said. "Yes," said Mr. Mortimer. He turned to Sir Mallaby. "We have at last succeeded in persuading your sister, Mrs. Hignett, to let us rent her house for the summer." Sir Mallaby gasped. "Windles? You don't mean to tell me that my sister has let you have Windles?" Mr. Mortimer nodded triumphantly. "Yes, I had completely resigned myself to the prospect of spending the summer in some other house, when yesterday I happened to run into your nephew, young Eustace Hignett, on the street, and he said he was just coming round to see me about that very thing. To cut a long story short, he said that it would be all right and that we could have the house." Mr. Mortimer took a sip of Burgundy. "He's a curious boy, young Hignett. Very nervous in his manner." "Chronic dyspepsia," said Mr. Bennet authoritatively. "I can tell it at a glance." "Is Windles a very lovely place, Sir Mallaby?" asked Billie. "Charming, quite charming. Not large, of course, as country houses go. Not a castle, I mean, with hundreds of acres of parkland, but nice and compact and comfortable and very picturesque." "We do not require a large place," said Mr. Mortimer. "We shall be quite a small party. Bennet and myself, Wilhelmina, Bream—" "Don't forget," said Billie, "that you have promised to invite Jane Hubbard down there." "Ah, yes, Wilhelmina's friend, Miss Hubbard. She is coming. That will be all, except young Hignett himself." "Hignett!" cried Mr. Bennet. "Mr. Hignett!" exclaimed Billie. There was an almost imperceptible pause before Mr. Mortimer spoke again, and for an instant the demon of embarrassment hovered, unseen but present, above the dinner-table. Mr. Bennet looked sternly at Billie. Billie turned a shade pinker and gazed at the tablecloth. Bream started nervously. Even Mr. Mortimer seemed robbed for a moment of his legal calm. "I forgot to tell you that," he said. "Yes, one of the stipulations, to which I personally was perfectly willing to agree, was that Eustace Hignett was to remain on the premises during our tenancy. Such a clause in the agreement was, I am quite aware, unusual, and had the circumstances been other than they were, I would have had a good deal to say about it. But we wanted the place, and we couldn't get it except by agreeing, so I agreed. I'm sure you will think that I acted rightly, Bennet, considering the peculiar circumstances." "Well," said Mr. Bennet reluctantly, "I certainly did want that house." "And we couldn't have had it otherwise," said Mr. Mortimer. "So that is all there is to it." "Well, it need make no difference to you," said Sir Mallaby. "I am sure you will find my nephew Eustace most unobtrusive. He may even be an entertaining companion. I believe he has a nice singing voice. With that, and the juggling of our friend here, and my sister's late husband's orchestrion, you will have no difficulty in amusing yourselves during the evenings. You remember the orchestrion, Sam?" said Sir Mallaby, on whom his son's silence had been weighing rather heavily for some time. "Yes," said Sam, and returned to the silence once more. "The late Mr. Hignett had it put in. He was very fond of music. It's a thing you turn on by pressing a button in the wall," continued Sir Mallaby. "How you stop it, I don't know. When I was down there last, it never seemed to stop. You mustn't miss the orchestrion." "I certainly shall," said Mr. Bennet decidedly. "Music of that description happens to be the one thing which jars unendurably on my nerves. My nervous system is thoroughly out of tune." "So is the orchestrion," said Sir Mallaby. "I remember once when I was down there." "I hope you will come down there again, Sir Mallaby," said Mr. Mortimer, "during our occupancy of the house. And you too," he said, addressing Sam. "I am afraid," said Sam frigidly, "that my time will be very much occupied for the next few months." "Thank you very much," he added, after a moment's pause. "Sam's going to work," said Sir Mallaby. "Yes," said Sam with dark determination. "Work is the only thing in life that matters." "Oh, come, Sam," said Sir Mallaby. "At your age I used to think love was fairly important too." "Love," said Sam. He jabbed at his soufflé with a spoon. You could see by the scornful way he did it that he did not think much of love. 4. Sir Mallaby, the last cigar of the night between his lips, broke a silence which had lasted a quarter of an hour. The guests had gone, and he and Sam were alone together. "Sam," he said, "do you know what I think?" "No," said Sam. Sir Mallaby removed his cigar and spoke impressively. "I've been turning the whole thing over in my mind, and the conclusion I have come to is that there is more in this Windles business than meets the eye. I've known your Aunt Adeline all my life, and I tell you it isn't in that woman to change her infernal pig-headed mind, especially about letting her house. She is a monomaniac on that subject. If you want to know my opinion, I am quite certain that your cousin Eustace has let the place to these people without her knowledge, and intends to pocket the cheque and not say a word about it. What do you think?" "Eh?" said Sam absently. "I said, what do you think?" "What do I think about what?" "About Eustace Hignett and Windles." "What about them?" Sir Mallaby regarded him disapprovingly. "I'm hanged if I know what's the matter with you to-night, Sam. You seem to have unhitched your brain and left it in the umbrella stand. You hadn't a word to say for yourself all through dinner. You might have been a Trappist monk. And with that delightful girl, Miss Bennet, there too. She must have thought you infernally dull." "I'm sorry." "It's no good being sorry now. The mischief's done. She has gone away thinking you an idiot. Do you realise," said Sir Mallaby warmly, "that when she told that extremely funny story about the man who made such a fool of himself on board the ship, you were the only person at the table who was not amused? She must have thought you had no sense of humour." Sam rose. "I think I'll be going," he said. "Good night." A man can bear just so much.